Hello everybody, it's Tommy and welcome back to another speed build for the Disney Save. Today, I have a absolutely brand new build for you guys and it is themed after The Rescuers. I mentioned a few videos ago back when I was doing Madame Medusa's home that I was thinking or planning that we might possibly do a second Rescuers themed lot in Willow Creek, which did not previously exist. I think the only Rescuers themed thing that ever existed in the original version of Willow Creek was just the Devil's Bayou, which was Madame Medusa's home. And I redid that and I thought to myself, I would like to put some more rescuers into this world if possible, just so that it's not only the one lot. And obviously Princess and the Frog is a huge inspiration for this world and there is a ton of work and things that went into theming all of that out and doing tons and tons from that movie. I still wanted to bring a little bit more to the rescuers if possible. So what ended up happening was basically I redid this entire little neighborhood. Previously, this neighborhood was the Louisiana shotgun homes that Tiana's mother lived in, and there were also some other residentials in here, that being the Maldonia estate. So that was actually a vacation home for Prince Naveen's parents and his little brother Ralphie to live in when they were like visiting Willow Creek or visiting him. And originally that idea was put into Willow Creek because it was basically like a last ditch resort option. I was done with Willow Creek and I had one lot in this neighborhood to fill up, and it was the only idea I could come up with. So I built them a little home. It was a little bit like Louisiana inspired, but it also had a lot of inspiration from like fantasy castles, that sort of a thing. And it added a child to the world, which was really something that I was excited to do because at the time it was my first world in the Disney Save and we didn't have any children's sims up until that point. So it was my way of like bringing in more family members, doing more age diversity and all of that. But as I replanned Willow Creek, I realized that if I was going to cut a lot from New Willow Creek, it was most definitely going to be the Maldonia estate. It is a recreation of like something that probably does exist in like the realm of the Princess and the Frog universe, but it's not actually a real true movie recreation. It's just something that I probably Googled like some various homes in Louisiana and found one that was particularly nice and expensive looking and did some kind of a recreation off of that. And I never truly really loved it. And I also don't think that too many people, when they play the Disney Save, are going to like jump at the opportunity to play with Prince Naveen's parents specifically. So I made the decision that they served much better as townies. It makes more sense that they're townies since they don't live like immediately in New Orleans. They're only really seen in the movie during the wedding scenes when they presumably come to visit for Prince Naveen and Tiana's wedding. And it makes sense that they would be around from time to time, but they don't necessarily need like a dedicated home in Willow Creek. Duke's Cafe is actually the lot that is currently on formerly the Maldonia estate, if that makes sense. And the reason I'm bringing all of this up is because paired along with the Maldonia estate, I made Little Kingdom Playground, which was a small fantasy castle themed playground pretty much exclusively for Ralphie because at the time he was the only child sim in the world. And it was a way to just fill up this space because as you can see, it's a little bit of a smaller lot and it's kind of awkward because this entire neighborhood is fairly decently sized. Like you can see as I'm building today, the two restaurants to the right of this, we have the Crown Jewel and Tiana's Palace. They are both pretty big restaurants. And then across the street, even the new shotgun homes that I just built, between the two of them, quite a bit of space. Duke's Cafe, also a absolutely massive building. So then I'm left with this tiny little lot and not a lot of ideas on what to do with it. So originally I thought, well, maybe I can make it a park. Maybe I can make it into what it was, like the Little Kingdom Playground, but just add on to it a little bit, make it more Princess and the Frog themed, add some trees, do a bayou theme, something like that. But I will say, I feel like I've really covered that theming and I did a lot of that in the previous neighborhood. So I ran a poll on my Patreon to get some ideas about what could be the potential option of what went here. And between the two options that I offered, this is the one that won. So this is Madame Medusa's pawn shop as seen in The Rescuers. Now, one thing to know is that this pawn shop does get shown in the film, but it actually exists in New York City. That is probably where Medusa primarily lives. She probably has an apartment near or above or somewhere close to her little pawn shop here. And most of the movie does take place in New Orleans because she actually gets on a plane and flies there. She believes that the diamond that she's looking for is in the Devil's Bayou, Louisiana, and she sends her little henchman out there to look for it for a little while, and then he is unsuccessful, so she ends up joining him later, and then most of the movie takes place with her living on the broken down abandoned ship. But she doesn't actually live there. She probably does live in New York City. So I could have saved this for the city worlds. Like, we have one world in particular that I would say is the New York City world, San Myshuno. But I don't foresee this fitting for quite a few reasons. There are quite a few ideas of things I'd like to do in San Myshuno. A lot of San Myshuno is apartments and going to be like apartment renos. And then the lots that we have that are by themselves where I can really just like build something, I have so many plans for, and I don't want to take it up with something like this. So this was probably the only spot and the only opportunity to extend on some more like specifically Madame Medusa, but also the Rescuers things, was to put it here on this really small lot where I could do like a tiny cluttered little pawn shop, run it as a retail. Madame Medusa is going to own it. You can play with it as her if you would like. Some of you are going to wonder why I didn't do this as a small business, and I originally planned to, and you'll probably see in the beginning of the video some moments where it was a small business. I'm really excited to start bringing small businesses into the Disney Save, and there is going to be one in this world coming up in a few neighborhoods from now. But the reason specifically that I did not do it for this lot is because to do a retail sort of situation, what I have read, and I haven't gotten a ton of chance to play with small businesses personally, so if this is wrong, definitely let me know. But from what I have read, if you try to run a small business retail, then you are responsible for restocking the items in the retail, which makes sense and is probably going to be useful for different ideas in the future. But this is a really small, cluttered pawn shop where I'm going to be using a lot of tool, a lot of move objects to kind of get things into places that won't easily slot in, if that makes sense. And so I felt like having to restock and replace the items and move things around wasn't going to be a very fun experience when playing this. If you do it as a retail, the game will automatically replace whatever is sold with the same object that was there previously. And that's one of the big differences, is my understanding between the two. Now, this is one of those things that if you really want to run this as a small business for some reason, this is very easily changed in the settings, and you can just switch it to a small business lot and add a couple things and it will run completely fine. So if you don't like my choice, it's very easily altered, but I just felt like this was the better option considering the movie, considering the popularity, and considering like the build itself and how it's not going to be super easy to replace everything that's in here. That being said, when I originally built the space, I was thinking that I was going to run it as a small business, and I was also considering that in New York City especially, where all of the buildings sort of touch and then you might have some little pathways that are kind of breaking things off, but most things are built in sort of like city blocks where a lot of the buildings will share multiple walls, and you'll have buildings that don't have breaks in between for quite a bit of time and then maybe like a tunnel here and there. There was a lot of additional building space surrounding this one that was shown in the film, and I wanted to recreate some of it, like the upstairs space specifically, because it would have been too small and a little bit uninteresting if I didn't do something like that. I also decided to add in the little tunnel on the side here. This would be obviously very much like a community-based sort of tunnel to just get you to the back garden areas or the back pathway. I have been doing a lot of integrating similar things and items to help the community spaces especially feel very cohesive. Lots of the same mailboxes, planters, plants, trees, just making sure that everything looks like if it was designed by a city, they probably would use like the same trash cans, the same benches all around. And so I wanted everything to match in that way. And that was also my way of trying to bring in the Louisiana feel, knowing that I'm building an apartment and a little pawn shop that is probably a New York City. Because one of the challenges here really is knowing that this building is from New York City. And so it has a particular style to it. There's some scaffold stairs and there is particular trimming, a little bit heavier use of metal. There are particular things that if I was doing this in like a city world, I would have leaned into a little bit more heavily. But I am essentially plucking it from New York City and dropping it into New Orleans. And I don't want it to stand out too much. I don't want it to look like it doesn't really flow with the rest of the neighborhood. And it's a different movie than the rest of the surrounding lots, but I just still want it to look really nice and put together and like the whole neighborhood makes sense, or it was built around a similar time. Hopefully that makes sense. So I had to tone back some of the New York City-ness of the outside of the building. I left a little bit of it there, and I still wanted to include things like the tunnel and the staircase. That staircase is actually going to lead up to a mini upstairs apartment that she presumably probably does live in when she has her home in in New York. But since this is a retail, for the purposes of the build, is kind of just for show, although you could spend basically so much time on a retail lot that you would stay there for multiple times, multiple days. You could sleep and you could basically just stay here. You don't really have to go home if this is like your full-time income when you're playing. So it is there to like kind of keep your sim alive. If you were going to run this as Madame Medusa, there is somewhere to go to use like a restroom. There is a bed up there, but we'll get up there eventually to decorate. Really what I did is kept the shape of the building and a lot of the features of the building, but I played a lot with color and I tried to bring in some of the earthier tones and some of the red brick and things that I had already used, particularly over at Duke's Cafe. When you sort of like see it across the way, you're going to notice that I'm using a lot of the same wallpapers and things. I'm trying to kind of match the corners of this little neighborhood. And I really struggled with this at first. I felt like it just looked so out of place and I wasn't sure about this build at all. It kind of ruined the entire vibe that I had created here and was really happy with up until this point. But I did eventually get to a building that I am satisfied with, and I felt like making it this small and giving some space around it to do like more trees and more plants that wouldn't have existed in the New York City version, but because this is in New Orleans, we have some more room to play around with greenery and we want those plants and trees and the willow trees and things like that. It helps to add the cohesiveness. Now for the interior, what's really cool is that Bianca and Bernard go through this entire building pretty much. So you get to see a really good pan around of the entire interior, and that means that I had so many great references to go off of and a floor plan. It's very exciting for me because I feel like I might not have gone this exact direction, but I'm really glad that I had this point of reference, because one thing that I might not have considered when doing a pawn shop specifically is that typically speaking, I've been in a pawn shop or two in my days. When you go up to the counter where you will speak to the person that you're going to try to do business with, you sometimes will have some sort of plexiglass, glass, grating, fencing in between the two of you, and that is a little detail that is significant to a pawn shop that I might not have thought of if I didn't have like proper reference for going into this. I might have set it up a little bit more just like a store, and I have been in pawn shops that are both or either. Sometimes it's just like glass cases or a little desk or something, and then sometimes it's a little bit more like this where the person that you are selling to is kind of sectioned off by themselves, and she has basically like this little back office area with her own door, and then where she does business and the little register and where she would speak to her customers would be sort of through this mesh fencing on the front side of the desk area. And you also get to see a lot of her back office. That is where most of the scene takes place. There is a phone call that she receives during this scene, and she sits in this back office and kind of like talks through the phone call. So as they're doing that scene, they pan around to the rest of the space a lot, and you get to see a lot of details. Now, as far as Madame Medusa and what she primarily sells in here, I'm not gonna say exactly, but let's just say that when you pan around and you look at what she is selling, it's a lot of pew-pews, and we don't have that in The Sims 4, and we never will, but it doesn't really matter. It's not something I probably would have wanted to clutter this place up with regardless, and it was not something I was going to attempt to like recreate by piecing debug pieces together or anything like that. I decided to go in a different direction and just sell what I assume is mostly junk. And I say this because Madame Medusa, her whole thing is that she really wants to get rich and probably just not work. So you could assume based on that she doesn't make a ton of money off of her pawn shop. She probably makes some money. She's in like New York City and she has some nicer clothing. She wears jewelry. She has some jewels on her that are like brought with her to New Orleans, and she has some furniture brought to the Devil's Bayou that in my opinion is like a little bit higher class. So it looks like she does have some money, but I would assume that her business is not going to be the most successful one. Otherwise, she might not even pursue the entire storyline of what she's going through. So I wanted to clutter up with things that are junk, stuff that is like antiques but maybe fake ones, fake jewelry, stuff that's like in disguise, things that are dusty, things that are probably worth money but maybe you don't really want, like the giant statue that I put in here from the new businesses and hobbies. That is the one that was from the DLC bonus, like if you pre-bought the pack or whatever, and it's really nice and I'll probably use it in other builds, and I was excited to have it. But it's one of those things that you would like walk into a pawn shop and you would see it and be like, oh oh, that's cool, and you would do nothing about it. Like, no one's buying that. And with Madame Medusa, she probably has it overpriced anyway. A lot of books in here, I felt like books are like a classic thing that you will see in thrift stores or pawn shops, and there's always like so many of them around, and nobody buys them. So that was the goal. I'm like kind of scrolling through the Build and Buy catalog, trying to find clutter pieces that I felt like were things that you do see in a pawn shop, but nobody ever buys. They just sit there and collect dust. There will be a couple breaks in the video where I sort of like make a pile of cluttered stuff on the ground and then I come back and place it all around how I want to. And I will say businesses and hobbies is definitely becoming very helpful immediately upon purchase, because one of the things that's included in that pack that we have desperately needed new ones of for a while is the display cases, and they slot really well. You can put multiple objects in them. They are something that you're going to see in a lot of retail spaces, and we just needed some new ones because really the only ones that we have previously, to my knowledge, are going to be possibly from Get to Work, and they're really old. They only come in a couple of colors, and to be honest, they're kind of ugly. Like, the meshes on them are not up to par and up to modern like Sims packs. So I was happy to have some realistic shelving in here and some things that you definitely would need, and then the simplicity of being able to like actually slot them in and clutter things up without having to do too much tool and too much raising objects up is really nice. I also used a ton of crystal creations in here because in the debug of crystal creations is going to be like a lot of little cluttered gemstones and some jewelry pieces and some of those like tray jewelry sets that you see where you have like a lot of rings and things like that. Obviously pawn shops are going to sell jewelry, so you want to have a lot of that out. In my head canon, this is all fake jewelry and costume jewelry for the most part. I do think she would have some like real genuine things and like nicer things in here. There are some instruments in here, and I felt like, again, because of New Orleans and trying to like tie that in, people would come in here and pawn off their instruments most definitely, and she probably would end up with a couple of nice ones and maybe even just like overprice them, and that's why they're not selling. But when it comes to the jewelry, and specifically if you think about Madame Medusa, she actually wears like really big jewel earrings, and when you look at her, you can sort of just like get the sense that she might be a little bit tacky, and they are so big and large that they are presumably costume jewelry. It's not going to be like real necessarily, in my opinion. So lots of jewelry, but it's all fake. Someone's old busted trophies that are like dusty. I don't even know why she would have bought that. Maybe some of the stuff is stolen too. I did think about that because obviously it's not past her or beyond her at all. So maybe she goes around to different shops and she steals things. Maybe she goes to garage sales and she buys little trinkets and tries to bring them in here and pretend that they are real or they are much more expensive than what she originally paid for them. There is some furniture, some dusty chairs, some paintings around, and I did end up doing this little cluttered bookshelf in the corner near all of the books kind of up against the glass that is snow globes, which are little objects that I just totally forget are in the game. But if you go to, the way that this is slotted for me is if you go to like the kitchen and you hit the food bowl in the kitchen, when you have debug on, you're gonna get a lot of like random little collectible items, the sugar skulls, some of the crystals in game, stuff like that. And I was scrolling through looking at all of that, of course, because a lot of that is obviously going to be helpful for the build, and I found a snow globe that I just never use those objects. It's one of those ones that I forget, so I was like, yeah, we'll put a bunch of those on one of the shelves in there, and I don't know, maybe people will buy snow globes. I used to have a absolutely massive collection of snow globes. I think it was my aunt when I was growing up, once a year for like my birthday would buy me a snow globe, and I had this long shelf in my room that went all the way across my wall. Like, it was a long skinny shelf with a little railing on it, and it must have been probably, and I'm trying to like remember back because I was very little when this happened. I probably was around the age of 6 or 7 when this happened, and I could have even had a few more than that, to be honest with you, because people saw that I got snow globes from like this one particular family member, and so everybody thought that I loved snow globes and they would gift them to me because they didn't know what else to get me as I was growing up. So I probably actually had more, like around the 10 or 13 of them. Really big, beautiful, heavy, nice snow globes. Don't get me wrong. It just like wasn't my thing even when I was younger. And my family decided it would be a good idea to line them all up on this shelf that went all the way across my wall. It was probably like 8 or 9 feet long. And it probably looked really nice to my recollection. But then one day I was playing in my room, absolutely nowhere near this shelf at all. I had a bunk bed at the time, so I was sitting up at the top bunk bed, and I heard like a creak and a snap, and the whole shelf on one side inside came off the wall, and all of them just slid down the shelf and smashed one after another right into one another and made this huge mess. And I remember just being so frightened and upset because I thought that for sure my family was going to think that I hit the shelf or I pulled the shelf down or I did something to the shelf, but I truly was nowhere near it, hadn't touched it. It was way taller than I was, and I couldn't have even reached it anyway, and it just broke, and it broke all of them, and no one ever bought me another snow globe after that. I probably would have some very nice Disney ones to this day if I still had some of them, because I do remember some of them being at least Disney themed. But all that to say, I'm not really a snow globe person. I think they're a little cheap looking. It depends. I have seen some nice ones. If you collect snow globes, I'm not knocking you at all, because I have seen some nice ones. They're just not my personal favorite thing to collect. So I could picture a bunch of those, like, especially those cheap little ones that you get from like tourist shops when you go to different countries, and they always have like the country snow globe. That's what I was picturing. Those like plastic ones, not like the nice ceramic ones. I do want to give a little shout out. Some of you probably already noticed, but in the paranormal stuff pack, there are these little voodoo dolls. And I kind of forget once again that these are in the game, but it came up because I was doing like my mega scroll through the build and buy catalog, trying to find anything that made sense to go in here. And I came across them and I'm like, yeah, you know what? A creepy doll or two definitely makes sense for a little shop like this. So let's get a couple of these in here. And I was going through the swatches on them and I realized, whether this is intentional or not, that the Sims team had made a Blossom Bubbles and Buttercup version. So I put the three of those together and tucked them away on a bottom shelf. Not Disney, but a little shout out nonetheless. If you ever notice them, now you know that they're there. It would be silly to think that the Sims team doesn't intentionally do things like that sometimes. I've noticed when they make clothes in particular and something is styled in a very similar way to like a particular Disney character, they will usually give us a colorway for that clothing piece that is very close to that particular Disney character, like for example Little Mermaid. That came up a lot in the Sulani pack, but also it comes up for Moana as well. Like a lot of the clothing inspiration and things for that pack, the color swatches pair over really well with things that Moana actually wears. And in Hemford on Bagley, there's one particular dress that I always claim just could not possibly be anything but inspired by Belle's blue dress. To me, it's just like a different version of it, and I always think it must be a little bit of Disney inspiration without actually doing it, because they would obviously get in a little bit of trouble over stuff like that. Side note, I will say I was not as worried about like technology in this build as I have been with Princess and the Frog. Princess and the Frog obviously takes place in the 1930s, which I've talked about quite a few times. So when it comes to like neon signs and fans and things like that, I'm not exactly sure like all the dates that those types of things came out, and I'm sure forms of them existed in that era, but sometimes when I look at the objects in game, they either just scream to me like a little retro, like you could put them anywhere between like the 70s to early 2000s period, or something is very modern looking, and then there's things that kind of come before that time, and that's the way that I sort of like break it off in my head. So you don't need to know that the year that the neon sign was invented to know that there probably wasn't going to be a ton of that in the Princess and the Frog builds, and it would look a little bit out of place. But for this movie, it's not as out of place. I actually don't even know what year The Rescuers takes place in, but I rewatched it twice recently, and just based on like airplanes and the way that they sort of did things, I can assume it was the early 2000s-ish in the movie is my guess. I won't go into particularly why I think that, but there's something to do with an airplane and the airport that makes me think that it is pre-2001, if you catch my drift. And actually, just mid-video Google search here, the movie was released in 1977 and it was set in the present day as of the movie's like storyline. So kind of what I was saying makes sense. Like to me, when I was using fans in here, I wanted to do a fan because I felt like they would have them, but not maybe like a full modern day looking AC unit in the window. So like those cheap little, not cheap, but like metal rickety sort of like fans that you might see in a really hot store in this time period. Those kind of like around on the walls and things. Neon signs totally make sense. The cash register that is not like the super sleek modern looking one with the touchpad screen, but the one that's a little bit older of like a regular style push one. And then I did give her the typewriter computer in here. Typewriters went out of fashion sometime in the 1980s, so it would make sense for her to have that in here rather than like a newer computer. So not scared of the technology, but still trying to think about when the movie takes place. And particularly with like furniture and things too, I really try to think about about that. I do not claim to be an expert by any means, but even just sometimes when I look at like the shapes of things or a clawfoot bathtub or like kind of how a toilet is carved, you can tell if it looks older when you look at it. There are ways that we build furniture in the modern era that would not make sense, and I don't claim to be perfect at that either. Like sometimes I'll go back into some of my older builds and I'll think to myself, why did you use this in here? Like this is clearly not in the correct era, but sometimes it's all we have at the time too. So there's a lot of things that go into like picking each piece in the build, believe it or not, and I'm not like perfect at it. Sometimes I have to do what's in the catalog versus what I would actually want to use, but it goes into thought a lot when creating the build. Now, the only thing in here that is missing is a kitchen. This upstairs area might get annoying because when you have a retail and you, like one of the differences between this and a small business is obviously you could designate the areas. So if you ran this as a small business, the top floor could be sectioned out as employee only. And then Medusa could come up here and maybe stay multiple days and run it and live here as her second home or whatever you would want to personally do for the gameplay. But you can't do that with a retail. And something I have found, unfortunately, is that when you're trying to like do sort of an immersive experience, it's really obnoxious that Sims will go places that they're not supposed to go. So whenever I build a retail or a restaurant or anything like that, it's a commercial space primarily, and that's how it's meant to be used. And you don't really want Sims to go into those other areas, even though they're decorated really nicely. I usually make them inaccessible because I find that in gameplay, it's really annoying and that Sims will just go up there and start using stuff. Like they come to the lot to shop at your little pawn shop and then they go upstairs and they sleep in the bed, or they go upstairs and they play with the makeup table, and it's very annoying. So what I have done in the past is I'll actually just remove the door and put in place a window, and then obviously if you're like okay with it and it doesn't bother you, you can replace that window with a door. If you remember way back in Tartosa when I was doing the Luca themed lots, I built a pizzeria and a ice cream parlor on one lot, and then over the tops of those buildings were these little apartments, and it was supposed to be the restaurant owner's apartments. But in gameplay, very annoying. Sims go up there and they want to like mess with stuff. So I did replace the doors with windows, and you can just kind of like make it look like a door. And that is a solution if you ever like want the aesthetics of it looking like an apartment, but you don't want too many Sims kind of going around and messing stuff up. You can do that. You also can just like be okay with it. I don't know. It depends on how you personally play. So for now, I'm decorating this space fully as like a second little apartment for Medusa, using a lot of furniture and things that I have already used in previous builds for her, like her bedroom and things specifically over on the Devil's Bayou. A lot of similar furniture. She does have, like I said, some money, it seems like, and maybe some like taste for finer furniture according to like kind of what she brings over to the boat home. So I do have like a couple of nicer pieces in here, but it's also not the cleanest apartment. There's some sludge on the walls and some cobwebs and just like maybe not the most like nice and neatly decorated space ever. And there's no kitchen in here. It wasn't really gonna fit, and I felt like it was just too much. It didn't need to be up in here. We can have it be like a studio apartment with much less than that, and she will be fine. Especially considering this is not her primary residential and I built the Devil's Bayou for her to actually live in, so you're not supposed to stay here is kind of my point. So a lot of this is for decor, and I'll see when I test the build before I release New Willow Creek if it's really annoying, and then I'll replace the door. But also let me know what you guys think about that, because I do run into that situation quite a bit, and if you are like on one side or the other, like you like having the second space or you like the door situation or the window situation, let me know your thoughts, and if not, let me know your thoughts as well, because I would rather know if I'm doing the right thing and helping people out by like making it run smoothly, or if you're confused when you go to these lots and like you can't get to certain portions but they're like fully decorated. With all of that, this little neighborhood in Willow Creek is complete, but I have so much more to come. I'm going to be pivoting to a different Disney movie. We're going to be going back to Dumbo to clean up that neighborhood a little bit and also add in a brand new Dumbo themed lot, so that's probably the next thing that you're going to see. Let me know what you thought of Madame Medusa's Pawn Shop in the comment section down below. If you would like to support the Disney Save on Patreon, you can do so by clicking the link in my description box down below, as well as the one at the end of the video. Thank you guys so much for watching today, and I will talk to you all in the next one.